My parents said I was a useless failure and threw me out. Go live in the streets, Mom yelled. They didn't know I earned $25 million a year, so I just smiled and left. 3 weeks later, the suitcase hit the front porch before I did. My mother stood in the doorway of the house I'd grown up in, her face twisted into something I barely recognized. Behind her, my father leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching like this was a show he'd paid to see. The November wind cut through my cardigan, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to process what was happening. You heard me, Mom said. Get out. Go live in the streets for all I care. I looked down at the suitcase, my old one from college, the zipper broken on one side, and then back up at her. 29 years old, and she packed my things like I was 17 again, getting shipped off to boarding school. Only this time, there was no school. No destination. Just the cold autumn air and the dead leaves scattered across the lawn where I'd learned to ride a bicycle, where my father had taught me to throw a baseball before he decided I wasn't athletic enough to continue. Can we at least talk about this? I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. There's nothing to talk about. My father finally stepped forward, his presence filling the doorframe beside my mother. He was wearing the polo shirt I'd given him for his birthday last year, the one he'd thanked me for with a dismissive nod before setting it aside. Your sister's getting married. She needs support. Real support. And you've done nothing but embarrass this family. I could have laughed. I almost did. But laughing would have given them something, satisfaction, maybe, or confirmation that I really was the unhinged disappointment they'd convinced themselves I was. The muscles in my jaw ached from the effort of keeping my expression neutral. So instead, I picked up the suitcase. The broken zipper gaped open, revealing a glimpse of hastily folded clothes, my favorite sweater crammed next to mismatched socks, a toothbrush thrown in as an afterthought. Vanessa is marrying a doctor, my mother continued, her voice rising with each word. A surgeon. A heart surgeon, for crying out loud. And what are you doing? Playing around on your computer. Pretending to have a job. You think we don't know you've been lying to us for years? The irony was so sharp it could have drawn blood. I stood there on the porch where I'd blown out birthday candles, where I'd waved goodbye on my first day of kindergarten, where I'd cried after my high school boyfriend broke up with me, and I felt the absurdity of the moment wash over me like cold water. I have a job, I said quietly. Oh, please. My father waved his hand dismissively, the gesture so familiar I could have drawn it from memory. Enough with the fantasy. We've seen your apartment. That sad little studio downtown. You can barely afford your own groceries. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that the studio apartment was a decoy, a place I kept precisely for moments like this, for visits from family members who needed to see what they expected to see. I paid rent on it every month, stocked the refrigerator with basic groceries before their rare visits, left carefully curated evidence of a modest life scattered across the surfaces. The worn second-hand couch. The mismatched dishes. The old laptop sitting open on the desk, connected to nothing important. I didn't tell him about the penthouse across the river, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and private terrace. I didn't mention the house in Vermont that I escaped to when I needed silence and pine trees. And I certainly didn't tell him about the investment portfolio that my accountant had to explain to me in chunks because the numbers got too large to comprehend all at once, the one that had crossed $25 million last quarter and showed no signs of slowing down. I didn't tell them anything, because they had never asked. In 29 years of life, through countless family dinners and holiday gatherings and Sunday phone calls, they had never once asked me a question about my work and waited for the answer. You're 30 next year, my mother said, and her voice cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion. And you're still playing games. Like a child. Like someone who never grew up. She meant it as an insult. But she wasn't entirely wrong, I did play games. I designed them, developed them, built them from the ground up with code and art and sound and story woven together into experiences that millions of people loved. And 3 years ago, one of those games had been acquired by the largest gaming company in North America for a sum that had required my lawyer to repeat himself 4 times before I believed him. But to my parents, video games were what teenagers did to avoid homework. They'd never understood. They'd never tried to understand. When I'd explained the acquisition to them, or tried to, anyway, my mother had changed the subject to Vanessa's promotion at the hospital where she worked as a nurse practitioner. My father had asked if I was still planning to take the LSAT. Eventually, they'd steered the conversation toward their own retirement plans, and the moment had slipped away like sand through fingers. Fine, I said. I gripped the suitcase handle, feeling the worn leather against my palm. I'll go. Wait. My mother's voice stopped me at the edge of the porch steps. For one naive second, I thought maybe she'd reconsidered. Maybe something in her had softened, maybe she'd remembered that I was still her daughter, still the baby she'd brought home from the hospital and rocked to sleep and helped with homework and driven to dance lessons. "Leave your key," she said. "You won't be needing it anymore." I reached into my pocket, found the key to my childhood home, the same key I'd carried since I was 12, the one with a scratched brass bow that I could identify by touch alone, and placed it gently on the porch railing. The metal was cold against my fingers, and for a moment I let myself feel the weight of what I was surrendering. "Goodbye, Mom. Dad." Neither of them responded. The door closed behind me with a sound like the final page of a book being turned. I walked down the driveway, dragging the broken suitcase behind me. My car, a practical, 8-year-old Honda Civic that fit the persona I'd carefully cultivated over the years, sat waiting at the curb. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing in particular while the reality of what had just happened settled over me. Then I smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile, or a satisfied one. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop for nearly a decade, and had finally felt it land. The smile of someone who had carried a secret so long it had become part of her, and who was suddenly, unexpectedly free. My name is Meredith Cole, and until 3 weeks ago, I had spent the better part of my adult life hiding my success from the people who raised me. The hiding started organically, without any conscious decision on my part. I'd sold my first mobile game when I was 22, still in my last semester of college. It was a simple puzzle game, nothing revolutionary, just a series of increasingly complex spatial challenges wrapped in soothing colors and satisfying sound effects, but it had caught fire during exam season when stressed students needed something to do besides study. The licensing deal brought in enough to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on the studio apartment that would eventually become my cover story. But when I tried to tell my parents, they hadn't listened. Not really. We were at Sunday dinner, the roast chicken my mother always made, the same china we'd used since I was a child. I'd practiced what I was going to say on the drive over, rehearsed the words until they felt natural. My father had asked if I was still planning to apply to law school, and my mother had changed the subject to Vanessa's new boyfriend before I could finish my first sentence. They assumed the money was a fluke, a small windfall that would dry up any day. They talked about my hobby with the same tone they used to discuss my childhood obsession with collecting rocks, fondly patronizing, already bored. So I stopped trying to share. I poured every penny I made back into development, hired a small team of developers and artists who believed in what we were building, incorporated a company that I ran from a cramped office above a pizza shop before we could afford anything better. By 25, my net worth had crossed into the millions. By 27, after the acquisition deal that changed everything, I'd needed to hire a full-time financial advisor just to make sense of it all. The acquisition itself had been surreal. I remembered sitting in a conference room with my lawyer and my small team, facing executives from North Star Gaming in their expensive suits, negotiating terms that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. When they'd offered the initial figure, I'd had to excuse myself to the restroom, where I'd sat in a stall for 5 minutes just breathing, trying to convince myself this was actually happening. The money had arrived in installments, carefully structured for tax purposes, each deposit landing in my account like a small earthquake. I called my parents after the first one, giddy and terrified and desperate to share the news. My mother had asked if I was still seeing that nice accountant from the gym, and my father had launched into a story about his colleague's son who just made partner at a law firm. I'd hung up and stared at the phone in my hand, wondering if there was something wrong with me that made me impossible to see. And the entire time, my parents saw only what they wanted to see, a disappointing daughter who refused to grow up, who had abandoned sensible career paths for some unfathomable digital distraction. They saw the decoy apartment, the old car, the carefully constructed image of struggle and mediocrity. They never looked deeper, and I never invited them to. Now, driving away from their house for what might be the last time, I felt something unfamiliar settling into my chest. I'd expected rage or sadness, or the hollow ache of rejection. I'd braced myself for tears, for the kind of gut-punch grief that comes with losing family. But what I felt was closer to relief. Like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. Like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying until it was gone. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "Mom said you left. Are you okay?" I pulled over to respond, not trusting myself to text and drive in my current state. Vanessa and I had never been close, not really. The 4-year age gap between us had felt insurmountable when we were children, and we drifted further apart as adults pursuing different lives. But she'd always been the buffer between me and our parents. The golden child who absorbed their attention, who fulfilled their expectations, who spared me from the full force of their disappointment simply by being so perfectly acceptable. "I'm fine," I typed back. "Just need some time." She didn't mean it. You know how she gets when she's stressed about the wedding. I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink. The wedding was 3 weeks away, a lavish affair that my parents had been planning for the better part of a year, their excitement verging on obsession. The venue alone had cost more than my first car. My contribution had been a check for $20,000, delivered anonymously through the wedding planner with instructions to credit it as a gift from a family friend. My parents would have questioned where I got that kind of money. Vanessa would have felt obligated to refuse it. But this way, they got the upgraded catering and the extra flower arrangements without ever knowing the truth. She meant every word, I typed, then deleted it. Too harsh. Too honest for a text message. "I'll be okay," I wrote instead. "Focus on your wedding. I'll see you there." But even as I sent it, I wasn't sure that was true. The wedding felt like a distant shore, and I wasn't certain I had the strength to swim there. The penthouse felt different that night. Larger, somehow. Quieter. The city lights sparkled beyond my windows like earthbound constellations, indifferent to the upheaval in my chest. I bought this place 2 years ago, after spending months convincing myself that I deserved something beautiful. The internal argument had been exhausting. Years of hearing my parents dismiss my work had left residue that was hard to scrub away, a persistent voice insisting that I didn't deserve nice things, that success built on something as frivolous as games wasn't real success at all. But eventually, I'd silenced that voice long enough to sign the paperwork. The real estate agent had walked me through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the chef's kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, the private terrace overlooking the river, and I had nodded politely while mentally calculating how many copies of my games would need to sell to justify the price. My accountant had laughed when I'd asked him if I could afford it. "Meredith," he'd said, "you could buy this building if you wanted to." But I'd never furnished it the way the agent suggested. No minimalist sculptures, no statement art pieces, no cold white spaces designed to impress rather than comfort. Instead, I'd filled it with comfortable sofas upholstered in soft fabrics, overflowing bookshelves crammed with novels and design theory and programming textbooks, and the kind of clutter that made a space feel lived in. My home office took up the entire east wing, with 3 monitors arranged in a crescent, and a whiteboard covered in incomprehensible diagrams that only made sense to me. I made myself dinner, pasta with garlic and olive oil, nothing fancy, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, watching the city lights flicker to life across the water. The evening news played quietly in the background, a murmur of voices reporting on events that seemed impossibly distant from my own small drama. For the first time, I let myself consider the possibility that I might never speak to my parents again. The thought arrived without the devastation I expected. It sat in my mind like a stone in still water, heavy but unmoving. It should have felt crushing. Instead, it felt like a door opening. A door I hadn't even realized I'd been standing in front of, waiting for permission to walk through. My phone buzzed again. Not Vanessa this time, but Eleanor, my best friend since freshman orientation. We'd bonded over a shared hatred of our dorm's communal bathrooms and had been inseparable ever since. "Dinner tomorrow? I need details about Thanksgiving. I have wine and opinions." I smiled despite myself. Eleanor was the only person in my life who knew everything: the money, the company, the carefully maintained fiction of my mediocre existence. She'd been there when I'd signed the acquisition paperwork, had celebrated with me in this very apartment while the champagne gave way to disbelief and then to something closer to fear. She'd held my hand through the first year of sudden wealth, when imposter syndrome hit me so hard I could barely leave my bed some mornings. "It wasn't Thanksgiving," I typed back. "That was last week. This was just a regular Sunday dinner that turned into an intervention. Even worse. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. I'm bringing the expensive wine." I didn't argue. Eleanor had never accepted arguments when she'd made up her mind about something. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with my parents in my mind. The way my mother's voice had cracked. The dismissive wave of my father's hand. I kept returning to the moment when she told me to leave my key, as if that single piece of metal contained everything we'd been to each other for 29 years. I wondered if she was lying awake too, somewhere across the city, thinking about what she'd done. Or if she'd simply moved on, relieved to be free of the burden of her disappointing daughter. The thought sat heavy on my chest, pressing down like a physical weight. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams I couldn't quite remember when I woke. Eleanor arrived the next evening with 2 bottles of Cabernet and a bakery box of croissants, because her definition of dinner had always been more about companionship than cuisine. "Start from the beginning," she said, settling onto my sofa with a glass in hand, her legs tucked beneath her in a position that looked more comfortable than any furniture arrangement should allow. "And don't leave anything out." So I told her. The accusations, the suitcase, the key on the porch railing. My mother's words, "Go live in the streets," echoing in my ears long after I'd driven away. I described my father's dismissive wave, the way they'd looked at each other with mutual understanding, as if they'd discussed this beforehand and agreed on the verdict. "They literally threw you out," Eleanor said, her voice flat with disbelief. "Like you were some kind of freeloader." "They think I am. To them, I've been mooching off. I don't even know. Their emotional goodwill? Their patience? For years." I sipped my wine, letting the warmth spread through me. "They've never asked about my work. Never once. I tried to explain in the beginning, but they just talked over me. Eventually, I stopped trying." "And you never corrected them? Never said, 'Hey, actually, I could buy and sell this whole neighborhood if I wanted to'?" I shook my head. What would be the point? They wouldn't believe me. Or worse, they'd believe me and then expect, I don't know, money, status, for me to suddenly transform into the daughter they actually wanted. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, swirling her wine thoughtfully. The liquid caught the lamplight, rich and deep red. "So what happens now? You just move on? Pretend you don't have a family?" "I don't know." The honesty surprised me. "I keep thinking about Vanessa's wedding. I'm supposed to be there. I'm supposed to give a toast. Are you going to?" I hadn't decided yet. The wedding was at a venue I knew well, an estate outside the city that my mother had fallen in love with the moment she'd seen the brochure. Rolling hills, ancient oaks, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers that cast rainbows across the marble floors. What none of them knew was that the estate had been my client 2 years ago. I designed an interactive experience for their annual gala, a murder mystery game that guests could play on their phones while wandering the grounds. The partnership had been successful enough that the owner, a woman named Patricia Chen, had invited me back several times since. Small world. Except the world isn't small, it just looks that way when you're hiding in plain sight. "I want to go," I said finally. "Vanessa deserves that. She's my sister, regardless of how our parents have treated me. But I don't know if I can sit through an entire evening of my parents pretending I don't exist." Eleanor set down her glass with deliberate care. "Then don't let them pretend." "What do you mean?" "You've been hiding for years, Meredith. Keeping your head down, playing the part of the disappointment. Letting them feel superior because it was easier than fighting. What if you just stopped?" I stared at her. "You want me to tell them? At Vanessa's wedding?" "I want you to stop diminishing yourself to make them comfortable." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression intent. "You're not obligated to keep their illusions intact. You never were." The thought sent a jolt through me, equal parts fear and something that might have been excitement. To walk into that wedding as myself. The real Meredith, not the carefully curated failure. But there were complications. Vanessa? The other guests? The very real possibility that my parents would find a way to spin the revelation into yet another mark against me. "I need to think about it," I said. "Take your time." Eleanor reached for a croissant, tearing it in half with practiced ease. "But whatever you decide, I'm coming with you." "To the wedding?" "To wherever this goes." She grinned, though her eyes were serious. "You think I'm missing the show of the decade?" Update number 1, 2 weeks passed. I buried myself in work, pouring energy into a new project that had been simmering in the back of my mind for months, an augmented reality game that would transform ordinary spaces into extraordinary adventures. The distraction helped. When I was deep in code, mapping out user interfaces and debugging stubborn glitches, I could almost forget the look on my mother's face as she'd hurled that suitcase onto the porch. Almost. Vanessa called twice. The first time, she asked if I was coming to the rehearsal dinner. I said yes, because saying no felt like a punishment she didn't deserve. The second time, she asked if everything was okay between me and our parents. "Fine," I lied. "Just busy with work." "They miss you," she said, and I could hear the hopeful note in her voice, the desire to smooth things over and pretend nothing had happened. "Mom mentioned you the other day. She asked if you'd RSVP'd yet." My mother, checking on my RSVP. Not calling me directly, of course, that would require acknowledging what had happened. but asking Vanessa to relay the question, as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't stood in the doorway of our family home and told me to go live on the streets. "I'll be there," I said. "Tell her I'll be there." When I hung up, I sat in my home office, staring at the whiteboard without really seeing the diagrams and notes scrawled across its surface. My mother missed me. Or at least, she missed the version of me that fit neatly into her expectations. The question was whether I wanted to keep providing that version. Eleanor's words kept echoing in my mind. "Stop diminishing yourself. You're not obligated to keep their illusions intact." I opened my laptop and started making a list. Not of grievances, that would have been petty and exhausting, a catalogue of wounds that would only feel heavier the longer I carried it. Instead, I listed facts. Things I had accomplished. Choices I had made that had led me here, to this penthouse, to this life I had built entirely on my own. The first game I designed, late nights fueled by cheap coffee and stubborn determination. The team I'd assembled, brilliant people who trusted my vision. The risks I'd taken, the failures that had taught me more than any success. The list grew longer than I expected. By the time I finished, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to the wedding to cause a scene. I wasn't interested in revenge or public humiliation. But I was done pretending to be something I wasn't. The question was how. The answer came from an unexpected source, Patricia Chen. I'd emailed her about a potential new project, something I'd been developing that combined augmented reality with event planning, a system that could transform any venue into an interactive experience with the tap of a screen. Her response included an invitation to lunch, which I accepted without thinking much of it. We met at a restaurant near the waterfront, the kind of place where the napkins were folded into complicated shapes and the servers explained each dish like they were narrating a documentary. Patricia was a striking woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made people straighten up when she entered a room. "I have a confession," she said, after we'd ordered our appetizers and settled into the comfortable rhythm of professional conversation. "This lunch wasn't entirely about your new project." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I heard through the grapevine that your family is hosting a wedding at my estate in a few weeks. Your sister, I believe?" The grapevine was generous. In Patricia's world, information flowed through a sophisticated network of event planners, caterers, and venue coordinators who knew everything about everyone. "That's right," I said carefully. "Vanessa? She's marrying a surgeon." Patricia nodded. "And I heard, also through the grapevine, that your parents seem to be under the impression that you're—" How did they put it? "The family disappointment." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound escaping before I could stop it. "Your grapevine is remarkably thorough." "My event coordinator is dating the florist who's doing the arrangements. Gossip travels faster than light in this industry." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me with interest. "It struck me as curious, given what I know about you. The Cole Foundation's most generous anonymous donor. The woman who built one of the most successful independent gaming studios in the country before she was 30. The disappointment. The Cole Foundation was a scholarship fund I'd established 2 years ago for students pursuing careers in game design. I'd insisted on anonymity, both because I didn't want the attention and because I didn't want my family to discover it. But Patricia, it seemed, had figured out what others hadn't. "How did you know?" I asked. "I'm on the foundation's board," she said simply. "The anonymous donation came from a trust. The trust was registered to the same address as your company's headquarters. Basic arithmetic. I should have been more careful. But then again, maybe I hadn't really wanted to stay hidden forever. Maybe some part of me had left that trail deliberately, hoping someone would follow it." "So," Patricia continued, "I have a proposition. The wedding is being held in my grand ballroom. I make a practice of greeting all major event hosts personally during the reception. It's an opportunity for me to introduce certain topics of conversation. If, for example, I were to mention that I'd recently collaborated with a brilliant game designer whose work has won international recognition, and if that designer happened to be in attendance, it might prompt some interesting revelations." I stared at her. "You want about me? At my sister's wedding?" "I want to give you an opening," Patricia corrected, her voice gentle but firm. "What you do with it is entirely up to you. You could smile and change the subject. You could let the truth speak for itself. Or you could continue the performance you've been maintaining for years, pretending to be less than you are." She picked up her menu, apparently satisfied with the offer she'd made. "The choice is yours. But I found, in my considerable experience, that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. The only question is whether it surfaces on your terms or someone else's." I spent the rest of lunch turning the proposition over in my mind, examining it from every angle like a gemstone held up to the light. It wasn't revenge. Patricia wasn't offering me a weapon, she was offering me a stage. A moment to step out of the shadows, if I chose to take it. By the time we parted ways, I had made my second decision. I was going to take it. The days before the wedding blurred together in a haze of preparation and nervous anticipation. I threw myself into getting ready with an intensity that surprised even Eleanor, who watched me try on 3 different outfits before settling on a deep burgundy dress that made me feel powerful without being ostentatious. "You're not going to battle," she reminded me gently. "I know." I examined myself in the mirror, watching the way the fabric caught the light, the way it moved when I walked. "But I'm also not going to apologize for existing. Not anymore." The rehearsal dinner was Thursday night. I had thought about skipping it, but Vanessa had sent a pleading text that I couldn't ignore. She wanted me there. She needed me there. Whatever had happened between me and our parents, Vanessa was still my sister, and she was getting married to someone she loved. So I went. The dinner was held at an upscale restaurant our parents had rented out for the evening, all white tablecloths and candlelight and waiters who moved like shadows between tables. I arrived alone, having convinced Eleanor that one night of family dynamics was enough for anyone to endure. The moment I walked in, I felt the familiar weight of observation, my mother's gaze tracking me from across the room, my father's carefully neutral expression as he accepted a glass of wine from a server. Vanessa found me before I could find a seat. She looked radiant, her engagement ring catching the candlelight as she pulled me into a hug. "You came," she breathed. "I wasn't sure you would." I said I would. I squeezed her back, genuinely happy to see her. Whatever my feelings about our parents, Vanessa had never been the problem. She had simply been born first, into a family that valued certain kinds of success over others. Her achievements weren't my failures. We were just different. "Mom's been weird," Vanessa admitted quietly. "She keeps asking if you've called, and then when I say no, she changes the subject. I don't know what happened between you two." "I'll tell you someday," I promised. "But not tonight. Tonight is about you and Marcus." Marcus was the surgeon. I'd met him a handful of times and found him pleasant enough, intelligent, attentive to Vanessa, blessed with a kind of steady presence that my parents found reassuring. He came from a good family, had attended the right schools, followed the right path, everything I hadn't. Dinner was an exercise in navigation. I sat at the far end of the table from my parents, close enough to Vanessa that I could participate in her happiness without having to interact directly with the people who had thrown me out 2 weeks ago. My mother made one attempt at conversation, asking about the apartment in a tone that suggested she expected me to report on my continued poverty. "It's fine," I said. "Everything's fine." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned back to the groom's mother. After dessert, Vanessa pulled me aside again. "Are you sure you're okay?" Her eyes searched my face. "You seem different." "Different how?" "I don't know. Calmer. Like you're not trying to disappear anymore." The observation hit closer to home than she could have known. For years, I had tried to disappear at family gatherings. To blend into the background, to avoid the pointed questions and disappointed sighs. But tonight, I wasn't disappearing. I was waiting. I was preparing. "Maybe I'm just tired of trying," I said. Vanessa didn't ask me to elaborate, and I was grateful. There would be time for explanations later. For now, I just wanted to get through the next 48 hours without causing a scene that would overshadow her wedding. Update number 2. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that event planners dream about. The estate looked stunning, white tents dotted the grounds like clouds come to earth, flowers cascading from every available surface, strings of lights woven through the old oak trees that lined the main drive. I arrived early, wanting to avoid the crowd of guests that would soon fill the parking area. Patricia had arranged for me to use a side entrance, one typically reserved for vendors and staff. It felt appropriate somehow, slipping into the wedding like a secret about to be revealed. The ceremony was beautiful. Vanessa and Marcus exchanged vows beneath an arch of white roses, their voices carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. I sat in the third row, surrounded by relatives I barely knew and friends of the bride I'd never met. My parents occupied the front, their backs straight with pride, oblivious to my presence behind them. During the recessional, my mother turned to scan the crowd. Her eyes passed over me once, then snapped back with a flicker of surprise. She hadn't expected me to actually come. Despite what Vanessa had said, despite my RSVP, some part of her had assumed I would stay away. I held her gaze steadily, refusing to be the first to look away. After a long moment, she turned back around, her expression unreadable. The cocktail hour gave way to dinner. I made small talk with the other guests at my table, distant cousins, family friends, people who knew me only as Vanessa's sister. They asked polite questions about my life, and I gave polite answers that revealed nothing. Yes, I lived in the city. Yes, I worked with computers. No, I wasn't seeing anyone at the moment. The familiar script, worn smooth from years of repetition. An older woman to my left, Aunt Margaret, I realized belatedly, my father's sister, patted my hand sympathetically. Don't worry, dear. You'll figure it out eventually. Not everyone blooms at the same rate. I smiled and thanked her, wondering what she'd say if she knew the truth. Probably nothing different, I realized. The narrative was too entrenched. In this family, I was the one who hadn't figured it out, and no amount of evidence would change that. The reception began at 5. I found my table, number 7, toward the back of the ballroom, and settled in to wait. Eleanor had arrived just before the ceremony, and she now sat beside me, her presence a steadying anchor against the sea of strangers. "How are you holding up?" she murmured. "Fine." The word was automatic, but I meant it. The anxiety I'd expected to feel hadn't materialized. In its place was a strange kind of peace. Whatever happened next, I had already made my choices. Dinner was served, toasts were given, and the dancing began. My parents held court near the head table, accepting congratulations and basking in the glow of their daughter's perfect wedding. They made no effort to approach me, and I made no effort to approach them. We orbited each other like satellites, aware of the other's presence without ever colliding. Around 8 o'clock, Patricia Chen appeared. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, pausing to speak with guests, complimenting the flowers, admiring the bride's dress. Her trajectory seemed random, but I knew better. She was circling, drawing closer to my parents' table with each pass. Finally, she arrived. I watched from across the room as she shook my father's hand, kissed my mother's cheek, exchanged pleasantries with the apparent warmth of an old acquaintance. Then she said something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw my mother's face change. A flicker of confusion, followed by polite interest. Patricia turned, her gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me. She smiled and beckoned. This was the moment. The opening she had promised. I rose from my seat, smoothed the front of my dress, and crossed the ballroom. The floor seemed longer than it had any right to be, the distance between my table and my parents stretching out like a road I'd been walking my entire life. "Ah, there she is," Patricia said as I approached. "Helen, David, I believe you know your daughter. But I'm not sure if you know that she and I have been colleagues for several years now." My mother's smile froze. "Colleagues?" "Meredith designed the interactive experience for our annual gala," Patricia continued smoothly. "Absolutely brilliant work. We've been collaborating on various projects ever since. In fact, I was just telling your husband about the Cole Foundation Scholarship Fund. I understand Meredith is one of our primary benefactors, though she prefers to remain anonymous." The silence that followed was profound. My father's glass paused halfway to his lips. My mother stared at Patricia as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "The Cole Foundation," my father repeated slowly. "Yes, the Gaming and Interactive Design Scholarship." Patricia's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes were sharp. "Your daughter has been remarkably generous. We funded 47 students so far, all pursuing careers in game development. It's wonderful to see someone giving back to an industry that's given them so much." I watched my parents process this information. The gears turning. The calculations being made and recalculated. My mother's gaze cut to me, and for the first time in years, I saw something other than disappointment in her eyes. She looked confused. Uncertain. Like the ground she'd been standing on had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "Meredith," she said carefully, "I didn't know you were involved in philanthropy." "There's a lot you don't know," I replied. My voice was steady. "Come. You never asked." "But..." My father shook his head, struggling to reconcile the image he'd constructed with the reality now facing him. "Your apartment. Your job. You said you worked in something with computers." "Game design. I've been designing games for 8 years. One of them was acquired 3 years ago for more than I could have made in a lifetime of practicing law." I let that land, watching their faces shift through shock and disbelief and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I didn't hide it from you. I told you, at the beginning. But you weren't interested, so eventually I stopped trying." Patricia, sensing that her work here was done, excused herself gracefully. I'll let you catch up. Meredith, we should discuss that new project soon. Of course. Thank you, Patricia. She melted back into the crowd, leaving me alone with my parents for the first time since they'd thrown me out. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Why would you keep something like this from us? I didn't keep it from you. I just stopped volunteering information you weren't interested in hearing. I kept my voice level, refusing to let old anger seep through. Every time I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject. Every time I mentioned a project, you asked when I was going to get a real job. After a while, I realized it was easier to let you think what you wanted. But we threw you out, my father said, and for the first time, I heard something like shame in his voice. We told you to live on the streets. You did. If we had known, would it have mattered? I interrupted gently. If I were still struggling, if the apartment really was all I could afford, would you have treated me any differently? Or would I still have been a disappointment? Neither of them answered. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we'd never said. Finally, my mother spoke. Her voice was small. Uncertain. We didn't understand. No. You didn't try to understand. There's a difference. Across the ballroom, the band struck up a new song. Vanessa and Marcus swept onto the dance floor, their movements graceful and perfectly synchronized. For a moment, we all watched them, the golden daughter, the successful surgeon, the picture-perfect couple that fit so neatly into my parents' vision of what life should look like. I'm not asking you to apologize, I said finally. I'm not asking you to understand, either. I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you. I turned to leave, but my mother's hand caught my arm. Meredith. Wait. I waited. She struggled visibly, years of assumptions and judgments warring with the revelation she'd just received. Finally, she said, I'm sorry we didn't listen. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was a start. Thank you, I said. We can talk more later. Right now, this is Vanessa's night. I walked back to my table, where Eleanor was waiting with a fresh glass of champagne and an expression of barely contained triumph. That was incredible, she whispered. Your mother's face when Patricia mentioned the foundation. It's not about winning, I said, though I couldn't help smiling. It's about being honest. Honesty can be its own kind of victory. Eleanor raised her glass. To the truth. I clinked my glass against hers. To the truth. We watched the dancing for a while, content in our silence. Couples swayed across the floor, laughing and spinning, caught up in the joy of the celebration. My parents were dancing now, my father leading my mother through a careful waltz, their movements practiced from decades of marriage. Watching them, I felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Love, still, despite everything. Grief for the relationship we'd never had. Hope, fragile but persistent, that maybe we could build something better from the wreckage of what had come before. A young woman approached our table, one of Vanessa's nursing school friends, I gathered from her conversation. She asked Eleanor to dance, and Eleanor shot me a questioning look. Go, I said. I'm fine. She squeezed my hand before disappearing into the crowd, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my champagne. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of dancing, laughter, and the gradual relaxation that comes when a weight finally lifts. My parents kept their distance, processing what they'd learned, though I caught them watching me several times throughout the evening. My mother looked thoughtful. My father looked like a man reevaluating everything he thought he knew. Around 10 o'clock, Vanessa found me on the terrace, where I'd escaped for a few minutes of fresh air. The night was cool but not cold, the sky clear and studded with stars. Mom told me, she said, settling onto the stone bench beside me. About your company. The foundation. Everything. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Vanessa shook her head. I understand why you didn't. Mom and Dad have never exactly been open-minded about career paths. I just wish I'd known. All those times you seemed so down, I thought it was because you were struggling. I didn't realize you were just tired of pretending. I should have trusted you with the truth. Maybe. She leaned against my shoulder, the way she used to when we were kids. But I also should have asked more questions. I got so caught up in my own life, I didn't notice that you were building something incredible. We sat in silence for a while, watching the lights from the ballroom spill across the lawn. Somewhere inside, the band was playing a slow song, and the murmur of conversation drifted through the open doors. Are you going to forgive them? Vanessa asked finally. I don't know yet. Maybe. Eventually. I considered the question, turning it over like a stone in my palm. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. They hurt me. I'm not going to pretend they didn't. But holding on to that pain doesn't serve anyone, least of all me. That's very mature of you. I laughed. I've had a lot of time to think about it. Vanessa stood, brushing invisible wrinkles from her wedding dress. Marcus and I are leaving in an hour. But I wanted to say, I'm proud of you, Mayor. Really proud. You did something most people never have the courage to do. You built something real, and you did it on your own terms. Her words settled into me, warming places that had been cold for years. Thank you, I managed. That means more than you know. She hugged me, a real hug, the kind we hadn't shared in too long, and then she was gone, swept back into the celebration that would mark the beginning of her new life. I stayed on the terrace a few minutes longer, breathing in the night air, watching my breath cloud in the November chill. Tomorrow, there would be difficult conversations. Apologies to negotiate, boundaries to establish, old wounds to examine and hopefully begin to heal. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. 3 weeks later, I sat in my penthouse office, reviewing the final designs for my new project. The city sprawled beneath my windows, alive with lights and movement, oblivious to the small revolutions happening in homes and hearts across its expanse. My mother had called twice since the wedding. The first conversation had been awkward, stilted with unspoken questions and half-formed apologies. She had asked, haltingly, about what I did. How games were made. Why people played them. I'd explained as simply as I could, and she had listened in a way she never had before. The second call had been better. She'd asked about my work, actually asked, with genuine curiosity, and I'd found myself explaining things I'd never thought she'd want to understand. Progress. Slow, uncertain, but real. My father had emailed. A few lines, carefully composed, acknowledging that he'd been wrong about me and expressing a desire to do better. It wasn't much, but from a man who rarely admitted fault, it was monumental. I'd read the email 3 times before responding, composing my words with equal care. There had been a dinner, too, just last week. My mother had suggested it tentatively, as if expecting me to refuse. We'd met at a restaurant downtown, not the usual family haunts, but somewhere new, neutral territory for this new chapter we were cautiously exploring. The conversation had been stilted at first, both of us dancing around the elephant in the room. But slowly, haltingly, we'd begun to talk. Really talk. My mother had asked about my first game, the puzzle one that had started everything. I described the late nights, the frustration, the moment when everything finally clicked into place. She'd listened. Actually listened. And when I finished, she'd said something I'd never expected to hear. I'm proud of you, she'd said. I should have said that years ago. I'd had to look away, blinking rapidly, suddenly unable to speak. We weren't healed. We might never be entirely healed. But we were trying, and that was more than I dared to hope for. Vanessa texted regularly now, sharing details about her honeymoon, asking questions about the gaming industry that I suspected were driven as much by sisterly interest as by genuine curiosity. We were rebuilding something, not the relationship we'd had as children, but something new. Something stronger, perhaps, for having been tested. And me? I was still learning how to exist without hiding. It was harder than I expected, shedding the armor I'd worn for so long. There were moments when I caught myself downplaying an achievement, deflecting a compliment, retreating into the comfortable anonymity that had protected me for years. But there were other moments, too. Moments when I owned my success without apology, when I stood in the fullness of what I'd built and refused to shrink. The invitation sat on my desk, a thick cardstock envelope, elegantly engraved. The Cole Foundation's annual gala, where this year, for the first time, I would be recognized publicly as the founder. Patricia had insisted. And for once, I hadn't argued. It was time to step out of the shadows. Not because I needed validation. Not because I wanted to prove anything to anyone. But because I had spent too many years making myself smaller to accommodate other people's expectations, and I was done. The story I'd been telling myself, that I was a disappointment, a failure, someone who didn't measure up, had never been true. It was a narrative constructed by people who didn't understand me, absorbed so deeply that I'd begun to believe it myself. But stories can be rewritten. Endings can be revised. I looked out at the city, watching the lights flicker like stars fall into earth, and I thought about all the people out there carrying stories that weren't their own. People hiding their truths, diminishing their gifts, shrinking to fit into spaces designed by others. My phone buzzed. Eleanor, sending a photo of the dress she planned to wear to the gala, followed by 3 question marks and a dancing emoji. I smiled, typed a response, and turned back to my work. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, millions of people living their own complicated lives, carrying their own hidden truths. Somewhere out there, a young designer was probably sitting in a cramped apartment, building something beautiful, wondering if anyone would ever see it. I hoped they would. I hoped they wouldn't wait as long as I had to let themselves be seen. The cursor blinked on my screen, patient and steady. New ideas waited to be born, new worlds to be created, new experiences to be shaped and shared. This was my gift, the ability to build something from nothing, to craft experiences that brought people joy. For years, I'd been ashamed of it. Or rather, I'd been ashamed of other people's shame, absorbing their dismissal as if it were my own truth. No more. The future was wide open, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was ready to meet it. Sometimes the people who should love us most unconditionally are the ones who hold us to the narrowest definitions of success. But worthiness isn't earned through meeting someone else's expectations, it exists in us already, waiting to be claimed. Your path doesn't have to make sense to anyone but you. And when you finally stop hiding the fullness of who you are, you might discover that the only approval you ever truly needed was your own.